Well, our speaker tonight is Patrick O'Donnell. This is his second presentation at the round table, and he's a really first-class military historian. He's the author of 8 books in addition to the one he's speaking on tonight. Beyond Valor was a bestseller and winner of the prestigious William Colby Award for Outstanding Military History. Into the Rising Sun, Operatives, Spies, and Saboteurs, The Brenner Assignment, They Dared Return, We Were One, which was selected for the Marine Corps Commandant's Professional Reading List, and Give Me Tomorrow. He's provided historical consultation for DreamWorks, award-winning miniseries Band of Brothers. Some of you might have heard of that one. Probably by far the best production ever done on World War II combat. And for documentaries produced by the BBC, the History Channel, and Fox News. He served as a combat historian and war correspondent in a Marine Corps rifle platoon during the Battle of Fallujah. And now this is a tale that he should be talking about tonight, or some other time. Well, it's not World War II, though, is it? But we had some discussions about it last night. You know, they talk about the greatest generation, but there's other great generations too. And if you listen to his stories of the Battle of Fallujah and the Marines who fought there, there's some pretty incredible stuff. And he went through it with them. Not as a correspondent with a cameraman, but as a historian with a rifle. So there's a tremendous tale there. He's an expert on World War II espionage and special operations and counterinsurgency on the modern battlefield. Over the past 20 years, he's interviewed over 4,000 veterans who fought in America's wars from World War I to Afghanistan. He's the founder of the Drop Zone, the first online oral history website for World War II veterans. So I think we're going to have a good talk tonight. Unfortunately, we don't have any veterans. This is a very narrow topic about one company, and there just aren't any in the area. Are there any survivors of Dog Company now?
There's 3.
3 left, and they're not in the area. So please welcome Patrick O'Donnell.
It's really an honor and pleasure to just be here tonight with you. And I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, Dog Company. For you those that don't know, this is not a Normandy book entirely. We're going to talk about Dog Company's entire campaign from Pointe du Hoc through Brest and the Hurrtgen Forest. These guys told me one thing repeatedly when I started interviewing them in 1997. Pat, our toughest mission was not Pointe du Hoc, it was Hill 400 in the Hurrtgen Forest. And I became obsessed with the Hurrtgen Forest after I heard that, as I always thought about Pointe du Hoc and these 90-foot cliffs, which is an incredible special operations mission that these guys somehow accomplished. But the Hurrtgen Forest in Hill 400 is amazing, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the program. But Dog Company's story really begins in March 1943 at Fort Meade, of all places. The main characters are a guy by the name of Duke Slater, who looks like Lee Marvin. Anybody that's ever seen this guy's pictures, and every one of the Rangers I ever interviewed are like, this guy was Lee Marvin's twin. He looked like him, he acted like him, he was that tough, and he sort of bred a sense of competition within Dog Company, and he was an incredible leader. Within that group was Len Lamel, who was his first sergeant at the beginning. And these men, along with other NCOs, formed the core of Dog Company. A month later, a small group from Fort Meade go down to Camp Forest in Tennessee, and here they form the 2nd Ranger Battalion. Men from all over the Army. A lot of times, most of these guys had no idea what Rangers were. Rangers and special operations in World War II was a very new and pioneering thing. The OSS doesn't get enough credit, but they are truly the forerunners of special operations. Rangers are also part of that complex tree. In Ireland, the 34th Division with Colonel Darby forms the 1st Ranger Battalion. Of 1,000 volunteers, only several hundred are selected. They're weeded out. The 1st Rangers, Darby's Rangers, goes through some legendary combat in North Africa and Sicily. And in 1943, they decide to stand up the 2nd Ranger Battalion and the 5th Ranger Battalion at Camp Forest. And here, they get sort of all walks of life from the U.S. Army. Nobody knows really what the Rangers are. They kind of hear about it a little bit in Europe. But sometimes it's a dumping ground for guys in other units. They just cast off people that they wanted to get rid of, and they said, go ahead and volunteer for the Rangers. But to somehow get through the Rangers was very difficult. Everybody had to volunteer, and then they put them through hell. I mean, these guys went on 15 to 20 mile marches, full gear, the whole 9 yards. And they didn't believe in, this is before people really understood dehydration and everything else. They had stuff with water discipline. You couldn't drink it, only had a canteen of water on a 20-mile march. People would pass out, etc. And this was sort of the training. There was a lot of hand-to-hand combat. There was stuff called where they had a pit, and they would have to clean out the pit. And this would instill competition. Really, the heart of Dog Company, the reason why it was a great company was their sense of competition, their sense of winning. And it stems from Slater and Lamel in all their training exercises at Camp Forest. And they don't do well. The parade ground stuff is a disaster. At the 2nd Ranger Battalion in the spring of 1943 and the summer of 1943 goes through several commanders. And it's not until a great commander, a Texas A&M grad, Earl Rudder, shows up. And Colonel Rudder is leadership defined. He shapes up the 2nd Ranger Battalion, and these men are good to go. They go down to Fort Pierce, where they do amphibious training, amphibious warfare, Scouts and Raiders school. Meet up with a guy named Draper Kaufman, who's really not the forerunner of the Navy SEALs, but we'll talk. That's my second, another book. But anyways, they get stung by a lot of jellyfish down there. They do some water rafting stuff, and they learn how to use small boats. They come back out, and they get ready for Europe. And they ship over to Europe, and they have no idea what their mission is. And they make it to a place called Bude, Cornwall, where they're put up in English houses. And the reason why Cornwall is important is because it's got a lot of large cliffs around. And these guys have to spend 5 or 6 months training on cliffs. And this is what I found incredible, is they did it without safety harnesses. They were scaling 100 to 300 foot cliffs without a safety harness, just with ropes. And then, as I looked through the documents, this hasn't been reported, the dog diary, for instance, that was kept by Lamel, Slater would actually shoot at these guys with live rounds. They'd shoot over their heads, so they got the sense of combat and what it was like to sort of be in a combat situation. They do a number of they train every day on the cliffs, and what's amazing is several of these guys fall off cliffs that are several hundred feet high, and many guys get injured, but nobody dies. 2 men actually fall off, and they land in the soft sand. They fall 200 feet and somehow survive. And one of those characters is in the book, and he survives this cliff accident. Everybody thinks he's bulletproof, and he decides to get a life, I'll get to this later, but he gets a life preserver that doesn't have CO2 in it, because he doesn't want to disclose that he has a defective unit, and he might get court-martialed for losing his, and he drowns at Normandy. But there's so many compelling stories in this book. One of the things that I was really struck by is the executive officer of the 2nd Ranger Battalion for a long time is one of the only veterans of actual combat, and that is Max Schneider, who later becomes the regimental commander of the 5th Rangers. And Schneider is a very, very interesting character that has post-traumatic stress disorder from his days of combat in Italy. And he actually has a metal plate in his head from an automobile accident that occurred about 10 years earlier. And he has a number of episodes of PTSD through the training exercises, and Rudder wants him relieved. He and Dr. Block, who is the medical surgeon for the 2nd Ranger Battalion, demand his removal, and Eisenhower actually steps in and decides to keep him, and he becomes the commanding officer of the 5th Ranger Battalion. But Schneider also has another interesting story. We think it's Schneider, but he lines everybody up and tells them that there's going to be 75% casualties 1 month before Pointe du Hoc, and men are given the opportunity to bail out. The death certificates were actually readied, body bags were readied by Schneider and other men, and these guys were faced with what most consider one of the toughest missions of D-Day. And what I found interesting is that, for a little bit of background, Pointe du Hoc is a kind of bony or a stony peninsula that juts out between Omaha and Utah Beach. And the reason why it was important is that there were 6 155 millimeter guns that were on top of the point. At least that's what they thought initially. And the point was a heavily fortified position. The entire top of Pointe du Hoc is a maze of bunkers and tunnels. It's ringed by tens of thousands of mines, making an airborne assault impossible. There's barbed wire everywhere. So Rudder and Schneider had to come up with a plan to assault Pointe du Hoc, and they decided the best way to take Pointe du Hoc, and perhaps the only way, was through a direct frontal assault, an amphibious invasion. And that's exactly what these guys did. Through the course of over a month, nearly 1,000 bombers plastered Pointe du Hoc. It was the #1 objective for the Army Air Corps. It was absolutely cratered all over the place. They dropped thousands of tons of bombs all over the place, but nothing hit. The myth, if you've watched The Longest Day, the guns weren't there. The reality is the guns were towed by the Germans after the first bombing raid, aerial bombing raid a month earlier before D-Day. They were towed about 800 yards inland into an apple orchard, and they were placed under camouflage nets. So they evaded aerial detection. The couple days before D-Day, the Rangers are on the ships, the transports that are about to take them across the channel. And the executive officer, the man who's actually going to lead Force A, which is 225 men to take Pointe du Hoc, is a Major Lytle. And Lytle receives word, we think it's a G2 report, that the guns had been moved. And he starts to, they have a party for a guy by the name of Joe Rafferty, who's a company commander, and he gets drunk, and he starts to tell everybody it's a suicide mission and that they're fools. And he actually punches Dr. Block, who's a surgeon for the 2nd Ranger Battalion. Colonel Rudder finds out of what's going on and decides to relieve Lytle on the spot. Lytle is not a coward. Later wins the Distinguished Service Cross in another unit that he fights in Normandy. But Rudder takes command of the mission because he realizes the only person that can pull it, he thinks that the only person that can pull it off from a command perspective is him. At the same time, he leaves kind of a vacuum at the headquarters level because he's going to be directing parts of the 5th Ranger Battalion and the 2nd Ranger Battalion in an overall headquarters capacity from the ships. So he moves on to the force, and then that morning, they get into the landing craft from the motherships, and they start to make their way to Pointe du Hoc, and literally everything goes wrong that can go wrong. And you start to look at these weird accidents, and it has a very profound effect on D-Day. The way things go. There's a British lieutenant who had been very inexperienced. They had a brand new radar set on the lead boat, and it doesn't work. And he begins to take them to the objective of C Company of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, Pointe de la Passe. It looks like Pointe du Hoc, but it's not. And they're all traveling towards this, and Rudder and Lamel realize that they're going to the wrong place. And they realize this, and they tell him to change direction. What's significant about this is the 5th Ranger Battalion, their primary objective is Pointe du Hoc. There's 1,000 men that are supposed to take this cliff. Their secondary objective is Omaha Beach. If they don't get word by radio that these guys get up Pointe du Hoc in 10 minutes, they go to their secondary objective. What happens is the most bizarre chain of events. He starts to take them to Pointe de la Passe. The 5th Ranger Battalion doesn't hear from them. All the radios don't work. They fail. They cannot contact the 5th Rangers. They proceed to Pointe du Hoc. The 5th Ranger Battalion at this point then goes to their secondary objective, which is Omaha Beach, and they are at the right place at the right time and help lead the breakout at Omaha. That battalion was supposed to be at Pointe du Hoc, but instead they're at Omaha Beach and they help lead the breakout. So it's an amazing twist of fate, how important the mission at Pointe du Hoc is in an indirect manner. But anyways, the 225 men of Force A hit Pointe du Hoc early that morning, and it's a hellhole. I mean, the entire cliff is ringed with IEDs, old French artillery shells that are suspended on wires. They brought in over a dozen men from a rocket battalion, Nimble Wafer Battalion, and they placed them in foxholes with MG-42s positioned there. And even though the point had been bombed mercilessly that morning, and many of these men had been killed, they got up, and as soon as they saw the landing craft approaching, they pelted them with belt after belt of MG-42 ammunition. And for the first time in the English language, this book has the German accounts on top of Pointe du Hoc and how they changed out their barrels in the MG-42s, how they were warping, and basically raining fire down on the Rangers. Many of the men in Dog Company are hit. Dog Company incidentally loses an entire landing craft by a near miss from an artillery shell. They sink. Many of those men are drowned. But somehow these guys scale this 90-foot cliff. Lamel, who's the main character of this book, is hit by an MG-42 round in the side and still scales up the cliff. Many of the men in Dog Company are killed down at the beach, but they make it up to the top along with the other Rangers, and then they have to fight through the top of Pointe du Hoc, which is a maze of bunkers and tunnels. Lamel takes out a machine gun nest, but there's an anti-aircraft gun that is active for 2 days during the battle, and it pelts anybody that moves, basically. And these men have to avoid that. And the Rangers at this point are fragmented, but in a great, a small unit action, these men all have a job and they know what to do, and they form up. Lamel has one of the largest groups of men, about 13 or so, at the top of the point, and they break through the German defenses and they start to look for the guns, and they realize that they are not in the kettle emplacements that are at the top of the point, and they're like, where are they? And instead of just hunkering down, Lamel continues to proceed to their secondary objective, which is to cut the coastal road on top of Pointe du Hoc and also try to find the guns. And he sees that there are tire tracks on a small country road, and these 12 men move down that road, and he decides to break up the group into groups of 2. And he and Jack Kuhn, they get through a few firefights, and they somehow find 5 of the guns, and they're in this apple orchard under the nets. And many of the Rangers were armed with something called a thermite grenade, which when it's uncorked, burns at a very high intensity, and it can melt pretty much anything that it comes in contact with. And he found the guns, which there was ammunition ready to go, and in a field about 100 yards away were the crews and about 100 men that were in formation ready to man the guns. And he basically, with his partner, disables 2 of the guns first, goes back and gets a few more grenades, and then uses his Tommy gun, smashes the sights, and destroys the others. And everybody thinks that that's the end of the Battle of Pointe du Hoc, and it's hardly the case, because what these Rangers had to face that night was some of their toughest combat. The Germans just wanted to run the Rangers off of Pointe du Hoc, and they came up with about 300 men. Rangers were arrayed in an L-shaped position near that apple orchard that I described, and they charged around midnight. The first attack was repulsed. The Rangers were out of ammunition and largely out of American guns, so they resorted to using MG-42s and captured German weapons along with stick grenades. They repel the first counterattack, but the second counterattack begins to break through, and they actually take an entire platoon from F Company prisoner or kill them. And they overrun the position. And Dog Company is in part of the L, which is obscured by a hedgerow, and they hold and maintain their position while the rest of the men retreat, but don't tell Dog Company. And there's a rear guard action, which is it's not Ranger-like at all. And if you'll read the book, they give one guy the mission, Elrod Petty, to somehow, and a few others, to somehow counterattack the Germans and hold them off. And it's really a very compelling story. Even in the story, Petty talks about, for the first time, rather sadly, how one of the men that they are with is a paratrooper. There were a number of paratroopers that somehow landed on the point. They were misdropped by their planes. And this paratrooper was fighting with them, and one of the men in Dog Company, or it was probably F Company, rolled a grenade under him unknowingly and killed him. A friendly fire situation. But Dog holds for 2 days. Rudder is with a guy by the name of Colonel Trevor, who led the 1st Commando in North Africa, but he's an observer and a trainer that is with the 2nd Ranger Battalion for the last 6 months, and he was at D-Day. And Rudder turned to Trevor and said, what do you think our chances are? And Trevor said to him, never in my entire experiences did I think I was going to either be killed or captured that night. That's how bad things were. And somehow the Rangers held. And the 5th Ranger Battalion, which landed on Omaha, as I mentioned earlier, on the 3rd day begins the link up. And there's a lot of, there's actually some tragedy there, because the attached 29th Division and some tanks, along with the 5th, roll in towards the point. And I'll never forget, several of my men that I interviewed said to me, one of our toughest fights that we ever had was with fellow Rangers. And they literally, because the 2nd was using captured MG-42s, they got into a firefight with their own men, and the tanks started to fire on them. And Doug actually interviewed one of the men that went out there and beat on the top of the hatch of the 45 of the tank with his 45, and told him to knock it off. But several men were killed by our own fire. For Dog Company, Pointe du Hoc is very bloody. If you look in the photo section of the book, the thing that after I got it from him, was what clinched the book for me, was a hand-drawn note from Len Lamel describing the casualties at Pointe du Hoc. Nearly every man in Dog Company is either killed or wounded, and 1 or 2 were taken prisoner. But the casualties were very, very high. For the next several weeks, the men of Dog Company, the 2nd Ranger Battalion, were sort of put in a rear position to to regain strength, to get reinforcements, replacements, if you will. They then went to Brest and were given another impossible mission. At Brest, the 2nd Ranger Battalion's objective was something called the Locust Battery. And this thing, also known as the Grass Speed Battery, was 280 millimeter guns that were buried several stories. There was a complex that was buried several stories deep into a farmer's field, and it was undetectable by air. And they weren't even sure exactly where this thing was. But it was able to repel a British warship earlier in the Brest campaign, the Warspite. And the guns were so big that the Rangers would describe the shells as like freight trains. And they could eliminate or basically vaporize an entire hedgerow. And these guys in Dog Company, as well as the 2nd Ranger Battalion, spent several weeks trying to find the guns and fighting in and around the area at a place called Hill 63. And several of the big guns from the Locust Battery literally buried some of the men alive. On 63, they faced a number of counterattacks and everything else. And really one of my favorite stories of the war, it's from a guy that I considered a good friend of mine, Robert Edlin, sort of changes the day in the course of that campaign. And Robert Edlin was with a small group of men that he always trusted, the Fabulous Four, he called them. And they would typically go out on patrol in a diamond formation. And one day in late August, they went out on a patrol, and they found a small path that in the minefield. The Locust Battery was surrounded, like Pointe du Hoc, by tens of thousands of mines, bunkers, machine gun positions, etc. But they found a small path that had been worn, and Edlin decided to go down it, and they found their way into one of the sub-bunkers for the larger complex of the Locust Battery. They broke their way through the door of the bunker, and they encountered several German soldiers, including a lieutenant, and Edlin captured them, and he said, "Handy ho, hands up," and the lieutenant said, "I speak perfect English, Lieutenant. I was educated in the United States." And they had a conversation. They said, basically, you're going to lose a lot of Rangers, or you're going to lose a lot of men trying to take this position. And this German lieutenant sympathized with Edlin, and Edlin said to him, "Why don't you take me to your commanding officer?" And that's exactly what this English-speaking German lieutenant did. They walked through kind of an amphitheater, like if you think of a stadium. They walked down a little bit of ramp to these huge, massive doors. The doors opened, they went inside, and there was an entire hospital complex there. There were nurses that were screaming. They saw these Americans and the German. And somehow, Edlin got to the commanding officer's office. And at this point, Edlin basically says, "Surrender the position." And the officer was very stone-faced, like, "Come on, Lieutenant, give me a break. I know exactly how many men you have. You have 4 guys. I have 800 in here. I'm not going to surrender anything." At this point, Edlin pulled out a grenade that he had hidden in his pocket. And when I first interviewed him, Bob was like, "Yeah, I put it in his stomach." And then I found out he put it right between his legs and said, "Now surrender the fortress or you're going down." And he got on the phone and he surrendered the Locust Battery. And this isn't a myth. There's, complete documentation on all this at the National Archives. Bob Edlin was originally given the Bronze Star for that action. And it was later upgraded to the DSC. But Dog Company and the 2nd Ranger Battalion kind of go through another interlude like they did after D-Day. They kind of licked their wounds from the Brest campaign, and then they're moved up towards the Hurrtgen forest. And, I think, Don, you've had some of your speakers here, Miller, etc., that the Hurrtgen forest was a dark and bloody place. It's a place I visited a couple times. I found very, very compelling. I've been there with, I actually toured the forest with German veterans that fought against the Rangers. And these guys go into this factory of death, which is one of the longer battles in the European war that the U.S. Army fought, and one of its bloodiest. 40,000 casualties, and most of them needless, because the Army and the brass didn't recognize the importance of the dams that were in the forest that could have flooded it, etc. But the Rangers go into this forest as a special operations unit. They're initially tasked with taking a town called Schmidt. That operation never goes off, and then they basically live a dog's life like every other infantryman in the Hurrtgen forest, in muddy foxholes, and they're being shelled day after day, and they're trying to basically fight through mines and German patrols. And on December 5th, the 5th Armored Division, along with support from the 8th Infantry Division, mount an offensive, which at the time was one of the deepest penetrations into Germany, and they pushed towards a town called Bergstein. And it is a very bloody affair. The Combat Command R of the 10th of the Armored Division is ground up. They were reduced to a company. The fighting in and around Bergstein is like a miniature Stalingrad. Guys wielding Panzerfaust, they're counterattacked relentlessly. They're basically holding on by their fingernails. As many of the guys that I interviewed in that unit said that they would have been wiped out if daylight didn't come when it did. And it also was, the relief came in the form of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. They had to get Corps approval to release the Rangers from reserve. And the Rangers marched into Bergstein the night of December 6th, occupied the basements of the homes. Only about 2/3 of the town was actually liberated from the Germans. The rest of it still occupied. But the primary objective of the Rangers that day was not to clear out Bergstein, but to take a hill on the other side of Bergstein called Hill 400. It loomed over the town. And the reason why it was so important was it was not only one of the highest positions in the Hurrtgen forest for artillery observation, but it also overlooked the assembly areas for the northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans wanted to protect this hill at all costs. And the morning of December 7th, the 2nd Ranger Battalion charged out of the basements of Bergstein and were immediately greeted by mortar and artillery rounds. And they had to fight their way through Bergstein. They went through a small church that was at the end of the town. There's a graveyard there, it's still there. And they lined up at a sunken road in front of a football field-sized open field. On the other side of that field were several bunkers with MG-42s, and then the entire hill, which was manned by Germans from the 276th Volksgrenadier Division. And that morning on December 7th, they lined up on the sunken road, and they were going to take the hill, or charge the hill at 7:30. And in a series of sort of bad leadership decisions, the attack goes off seconds earlier. At the beginning of, right before 7:30, a new lieutenant from F Company demands that one of the main characters in this book, Elrod Petty, send out a scout across this open field. Petty, who had been a combat veteran of Normandy and everything else, realized that this is suicide. And he said, no. And the lieutenant goes, that's an order. And then he says, fuck you. And he tells the guy not to go. They try to hold him back, but the lieutenant goes, it's an order. And what's surprising is the other senior NCOs didn't stop it. The man crawls out into the field, and he's immediately shot in the stomach. This creates basically the spring that is so tightly wound, it basically breaks at this point. These men charge out of the sunken road about a minute or so before They're supposed to. And why this is important is because German artillery is falling behind them and American artillery is falling in front of them. And basically it is converging. If they had waited till 7:30, it would have fallen right on top of their heads. They go a little bit earlier, they charge across the field, they bayonet a number of these with a full bayonet charge. They go across the field, I might add, one of the few in the European theater. And they take out those early machine gun positions and they charge as fast as they can up the hill. And this is only the beginning of the story. They are supposed to take the hill and keep it for one day. They hold it for over 2 days. And it's against nearly 5 or 6 counterattacks by the German army. The 272nd Volksgrenadier is not, everybody thinks of old men. It's mainly staffed by Luftwaffe guys, along with experienced NCOs. They're equipped with the MG-44, the early precursor, if you will, to the AK-47. And they're well trained and they're well motivated. And they charge a number of times up the hill. They're stopped. They throw in the elite parachute regiment or battalion that's nearby, the 6th. The Rangers are so desperate. I mean, one of the accounts that I was really blown away by is Ed Secor, who his BAR is hit by a bullet and it's jammed. He can't fire it, throws it away, and he picks up 2 MP40s, I'm sorry. Could have been MG44s, or MP44s, I should say. And with both hands fires into the oncoming rushing Germans and helps stop one of those counterattacks. And this goes on for 2 days straight. They bring in assault guns and they rain down 18 battalions of German artillery on top of the hill. American artillery is also very active. There's a forward observer in a bell tower, and he is calling artillery right on top of the Rangers' positions. Things are so desperate on top of Hill 400. There are so many wounded men, and there's no place to hide. The ground is so rocky, they can't dig in. Everybody is being pelted by shrapnel. Lamel asks the men if they want to leave the guys on top of 400 and evacuate the hill. And to a man, they say, "No, Len, we're not doing it." And they decide to hold Hill 400 because his thought was at least the Germans would take them into custody and save their lives. They hold 400 somehow miraculously. 13th Regiment goes up. They see a lot of activity in the northern shoulder. There's numerous reports of large concentrations of armor, etc., and none of that information ever it is never acted upon. And on December 16th, the Battle of the Bulge begins, to the surprise of America. And many men are lost. The intelligence isn't followed. And the Rangers are placed in the northern shoulder of the Bulge. They have limited contact with Skorzeny's paratroopers, etc., and other numerous German patrols. They cross the Roer River. They are then part of the advancing Patton's Third Army. They go on the backs of M2 Greyhounds, armored cars, and half-tracks, and they sort of dismount whenever there's a problem and clean out pockets of resistance and then keep moving forward. And they push down into to Austria. And the book covers their experience there, and then they disband. And for many of the men, their story doesn't ever come around until the 40th anniversary of D-Day, when Ronald Reagan makes the Boys of Pointe du Hoc, his signature speech. And it's a bittersweet moment for many of these men. Not everybody, most people appreciated that, but there were many men in the 2nd Ranger Battalion, like many men of many wars in American history, that suffered PTSD. There was one man that killed himself that day. But for me, this is a book about many of my friends. There's only 3 of them left. I interviewed countless members of Dog Company beginning in 1997, and now there's few of them left. But it's it's a legacy of courage, and I'm very grateful for the World War II veterans that are here in the audience, because the story is a story, and for me, that's what it's been all about. So thank you.
Any questions from the audience?
Let me ask one.
Sure.
Since I was indoctrinated at Texas A&M by Earl Rudder, can you tell the story of when they went into the wrong objective, and then rather than coming back out, they actually went parallel to the fire? Can you talk about that briefly?
To save time, Rudder knew that every minute counted. So they went parallel to the fire, and as these landing craft paralleled Omaha Beach, they were peppered by machine gun and artillery mortar fire. And then they moved towards their objective.
And one other thing that...
And Rudder was was nearly killed on a number of occasions. The book has a picture of him with his gas mask on in his... I think it's his M41 field jacket, but if you look closely at it, it's covered with splotches. It's covered with yellow splotches because there was something called it was a marker shell that came in from the battleship Texas was firing in to basically give shore bombardment or counter protective fire to the Rangers, and one of the shells was a near miss, and it hit the command bunker that Rudder was in and killed the man next to him and wounded him.
But one of the other things, if you recall, they were firing these grappling hooks up onto the bluffs to go up, and in that transportation that transit from the wrong objective to Pointe du Hoc, the ropes got saturated with the seawater splashing into and many of those grappling hooks did not make the bluffs because of that action.
And the Germans actually cut some of the ropes too that did make it up there.
This isn't a question, but a statement. If you go up to Duluth, Minnesota, the federal courthouse is going to be named after Gerald W. Haney. Haney was there during this whole event. And I forget which company he was on, but he was on Omaha Beach. And he used to talk about the Hurrtgen Forest as D-Day was hard, but the Hurrtgen Forest was just something else from a standpoint of up the hill trying to take it and then being beat back. And it was always a question that I had, is why that battle was never spoken about until, as you say, when President Reagan gave a speech on the boys of Pointe du Hoc. I couldn't find anything really very, very much on it until after that.
The way that Len Lamel described the shrapnel on top of Pointe du Hoc was picture a rainstorm, but instead of raindrops, it was raining metal, and it was digging into everybody. It was that severe. 18 battalions of German artillery raining down on this hill, as well as American artillery is coming down too, and it was very traumatic. One of the men that I interviewed his name was Morris Webb, and Webb, he's in the book Beyond Valor. He's one of the last stories in the book. Webb comes home, and he said he survived the battle. He was okay, but he completely lost it as soon as he got to America. And he had to be, he had to see he was committed, basically, to electric shock therapy and everything else. And he said that the bombardment was so severe, it was like a rubber band that had it just kept winding and winding, and finally when he got back to the United States, it just broke. But that's how severe that shelling was for those men.
The gentleman you talked about jumping in the tanks was my father.
We saw his oral history today at the Minnesota Historical Society.
But he said he came in the landing craft with half tracks, and there was mention in one of Darby's book there that a cannon platoon by Lieutenant Epperson joined them. But he said they landed in the wrong spot because there was no way for these half tracks, and they just got shelled. And how? I mean, with that unit, if you're just decimated, he continued on then, and it sounded like the half tracks were destroyed.
I did the interview with your dad.
Yeah.
And on one of the half tracks, the guys didn't properly waterproof it, and it stalled out. A second one was hit by a mortar round, and all the guys inside were killed. And I forget if they had 3 or 4. I think they had 4 of them. They had 75 millimeter guns mounted in the half tracks, and 2 of them made it up. And then I think they lost them at Brest. I think after Brest, they took them away from them. And then your dad, he got a Silver Star with the incident with the tank. He had a tattoo on his arm.
Right.
And he put the tattoo up to I don't know what the tattoo was, but it must have been something not German, because he put it up to the vision port on the tank, and then they opened up the hatch and talked to him, and he said, don't shoot at those guys over there, they're Americans. But after Brest, they made him the motor officer in the battalion, and that's what he did for the rest of the war.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming to represent your dad.
But in terms of the replacements, they were pretty good. They were not as well trained necessarily as the guys in the original unit. But there's an excellent quote in the book from L. Rod Petty, who said, who I think was he was initially a Dog Company vet, and then he got transferred over to F Company. But his comments on some of the replacements was, what it takes to be a great soldier is a big set of balls and a brain. And it sort of panned out with a lot of these replacements. They were pretty good guys, and fought well, through the war. And there's a fair amount in the book about their interaction with the men and how they were taken in, etc.
I had a very close boyhood friend whose father was a survivor of the Hurrtgen Forest. I think they called it the meat grinder. He was wounded and captured and spent the balance of the war in a German POW camp. But he is very philosophical and objective about that whole mission. And he felt that the Hurrtgen Forest had very little strategic value. And that's one of the reasons why it really wasn't talked about much. That the Germans that were in the Hurrtgen Forest could easily have been bypassed and carpet bombed, or dealt with in some other way than an infantry assault. And I'd like your comments on that, please.
I think it was an incredible waste of life, and nobody was really held accountable for it. And a lot of men needlessly died in the Hurrtgen Forest.
I think Bradley gives it like one paragraph in his summary of his experiences.
General Gavin later commented on it too, on being a complete.
What I'm saying, Bradley didn't want it talked about.
No, most of these guys never did.
And I remember people coming back and being remarkably normal who had served. Once in a while you hear the term he was shell-shocked. Well, obviously that's PTSD today. You referenced that. And I noticed when I was in the service during Vietnam era, I saw a lot of mental illness, a tremendous volume. I was a flight surgeon. And I'm wondering, do you think there was a significantly lesser incidence of mental illness after World War II vis-a-vis Vietnam?
What I found, I'm writing a book on the American Revolution. It was there too, PTSD. Just it wasn't as recorded as often, but it's in their diaries as well. It's in every war. My book, Beyond Valor, I wanted to capture something called the hidden war. It was kind of the feelings and emotions that many of these guys bottled up over the years. this didn't call it PTSD then. It was shell shock or whatever. And many of these Rangers, men that had been through some very significant, serious contact, had received it. And I saw it in the Darby's Ranger veterans that I interviewed, the Marine veterans. It just depends on the individual, really. And then they came home. Many of the men came home, and it sort of depended on their experience when they came home, too. That had an impact as well. Those that were able to find employment and sort of get their mind off the war were able, in many cases, to recover more quickly. Others didn't. And you know, I had interviewed many men that had never talked about the war until they talked to me for the first time. And it was a very cathartic experience because they had been living with PTSD for years.
In the round tablet, it's noted that our troops dispatched or executed some Frenchmen who they felt were helping the Germans. I haven't heard of that before, in that arena at least, and I'm a little surprised that there were Frenchmen in that area because I thought they had moved the civilians out. Any comments?
Yes, there were accounts of that. It's one of the accounts that I decided not to put in the book. The accounts they're credible, but the individual that told me the account is dead. It was backed up by another individual who's dead, and it's a compelling story, but it's one I decided not to include. But the book isn't sanitized because there's plenty of accounts in this book where, I shouldn't say plenty, but there are accounts. In some cases, it's not even dog company veterans, but where a lone prisoner or several prisoners are quote shot trying to escape, you know, or killed or executed, and you know, it's hard to comment on that.
Because I was at Pointe du Hoc last month, and just standing and overlooking that point, just one observation is that that point isn't the point that it used to be. It's like everything that happens, the weather and the years, it looks like the cliff has been kind of eroded a bit. And then seeing all those craters, it just seems like when those shells came in, of course, they were after the original gun emplacements. But I'm wondering, and I couldn't really tell because we visited a lot of the gun emplacements and walked in and looked, you know, where the guys were down below and everything. Did any of those shells right near Pointe du Hoc hit anything direct?
They completely plastered the top of Pointe du Hoc. There's some great pictures in here of aerial photos, after action photos, and the thing looks like the surface of the moon. And if you go there, it's a very, it's probably the most iconic and compelling place you can go other than the cemetery in Normandy. In the scars of war are still so visible. You know, entire massive slabs of these bunkers are tilted upside down, and the shell holes and craters are still there. As you say, there's a lot of erosion. I'm happy to report that the observation post, which is at the very tip of Pointe du Hoc, has been restored, and you can actually go into that.
I was in the South Pacific in the Navy with Halsey's Navy, and my brother was in the landing in Europe. And after the war, he always commented, "Thank God for the Navy." Could you comment on that?
Well, first I want to say thank you for your service.
You notice he's got a Navy cap on.
Thank you for your service, and you know, you bring up a very good point. At Pointe du Hoc, the Navy did provide some crucial support for the point, for those Rangers. The destroyers came in, nearly beached themselves, and fired their guns, you know, in direct support of the Rangers. And the Texas also fired a number of shells that repelled several of these counterattacks. So
what was the total casualties in the Hurrtgen forest And did they estimate that most were killed by mortars or artillery?
They estimate the casualties to be about 40,000 killed and wounded. It's not completely, the number's not totally there. And I've never seen a breakdown in terms of what the deaths were attributed to. But you know, the Rangers that I talked to and the other veterans that I interviewed, they always talked about the tree bursts and the artillery and the mines, which were everywhere in the forest. Every position was zeroed in. There was, the bunkers had perfect, crossfire. It was very, very difficult to go anywhere in the forest. The one thing that I did not mention in the presentation was that the last bombing that occurred around 6:30 in the morning on D-Day by, I think it was nearly 100 B-26 bombers that hit the point. It was very odd. It was, the strike was off by several minutes. And this is another situation where if Lieutenant Beaver hadn't made the navigation error, the men would have been basically landing on the point exactly when those bombers were striking, and it's likely that they would have been largely killed. It's another twist of fate in history.
With the bunkers at Pointe du Hoc, there's one or two, maybe 25, 30 bunkers up there, counting all the ammunition bunkers and everything. There's one that completely came apart, and it's just big chunks of concrete. But the other ones where a bomb went off, maybe a 500-pound, 1,000-pound bomb went off next to it, the entire bunker is just tilted, but it's intact. And there's other bunkers that have huge craters on the top, but the inside of the bunker is intact. You know, that cement was okay, but very little can withstand what we inflicted on the place.
The book also captures the German accounts of the bombing and how many men were buried alive. There's a scene in the book that I got translated where one of the guys is coming out full of blood. His whole face and head is completely covered in blood and is covered in dust and cement debris from the bombing. And he's just yelling, saying kaput, kaput. And then they see sort of the D-Day moment. They survive this blast, this massive bombardment. They crawl out. Most of their eardrums are destroyed. And then they see the Allied Armada. And that's another oral history in there of, my God, hundreds of ships. And the one guy says, they're coming for us. And you see the landing craft from Forcey.
And thank you for coming. Come next month.
Production services provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.